Sounds great. Welcome everyone to this product conference. Thank you organizers for inviting me. Quite excited to face such an awesome group of product-minded people. I'll make my intro short. I'm assuming we're going to focus mostly on Q&A in this section. The title of the section is Managing Products for Maximum Impact, something that's dear to my heart. That's what my passion about products is. Obviously, we build products primarily for customers, and we want our products to land with those customers really well. The meaning, what different people mean different things when they talk about impact. I usually distill it to 3 actionable insights. There is definitely more if you go deep, but if you want small number, if you want to focus young product managers on what can you learn early on to be able to be more efficient and to deliver again larger impact to customers. So those 3 things usually distill maximum impact to. Number 1, you need to understand what your customers want. It's kind of basic thing, but specifically, again, talking about young people who are just in their first, second, third year in product, I'm seeing a lot when it kind of feels like you know everything, right? Only much later you learn that you don't know what you know, what you don't know, but then it turns out that what you think you know also is not exactly as clear. So this focus on understanding things deeply, and the word understand is also kind of a deep word. You can go much into different levels of depth. What does it mean? Do you understand things, right? Do you understand the data? Do you understand the qualitative insights? But this is number 1, right? You cannot move forward. You cannot just build features and, for example, drive metrics up or down, etc. You really need to have understanding who your customers are, what do they want, what their problems are, what they get excited about, etc. This depth around understanding is critical. Second is the focus on running experiments, because even when you understand things or you think you understand, the world is just too complex and people behave in ways which we cannot really describe, we cannot comprehend. So the discipline around running experiments organizes you and makes sure that you ship things which improve your product and not necessarily make it worse. The reasoning behind experimentation, again, this is not new to anyone. I'm probably not saying anything super revealing, but the importance of running experiments is that on a long time horizon, right? Compounding is what really matters. If you just keep doing this 1% change every single day for X days, then it's everyone knows, right, that you're going to end up in a really awesome place. And if you do minus 1% change over X days, then you're eventually going to end up in 0, right? So those small incremental improvements matter a lot. And by running experiments, especially with companies which are growing, which are getting into large size, it's becoming increasingly more important because you have fiduciary duty to your customers and to your shareholders to make improvements. And again, running experiments allows you to be more confident that you're launching successful products rather than not successful products. And then the last one, which is probably the least straightforward of the 3. The last one is aligning your organization. So when you get into a role which allows you to manage and lead the organization, then structuring your team and motivating your team towards success becomes critically important. You're not necessarily building the products yourself anymore. You're kind of more focusing on what the vision is, what the organization structure is, and what the incentive structure for your employees is. So this alignment to part 1, you understand the customer needs. And then you understand the most important of those, and aligning your organization to those customer needs is critical. And I'll show you some example of where you have to think twice. In many cases, we build teams around, again, features or technologies, and some viral teams in recent years have been growth, for example. Everyone wants to work on the growth team. I'm not saying that you never should have growth team, but there is plenty of examples of really awesome companies which eventually retired those teams, right? They've gotten bad reputation for growing at all costs. And they kind of came to a realization that we have to retire those teams to show clearly that we're focusing on what customers care about. The second example, well, I'll just give machine learning is also viral. Big data is quite viral. So many companies have those teams. And again, not saying that you should not have them, but whenever you have those teams, you should have understanding what those teams are doing. You cannot just be running machine learning for the sake of machine learning. So that's my brief introduction. Happy to get into questions.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much. This is people, this is an instruction, 3 steps, what you should do to build a product with impact. Thank you so much, Vasily. And we have several questions, but before I move on to them, I actually wanted to ask a question of my own about your product, Revolut. I was one of the lucky ones to test it in the USA, among the first ones. And I was just wondering, so what would, I'm sure like European market and American market are very different, and banking systems are too. And were there any big differences in customer needs in the USA and in Europe? How was it challenging for you to explore those needs to build your product?
And you're asking now specifically about banks, not overall like differences across multiple products, right? Are you asking about banking?
Oh, I'm asking specifically about the process of building Revolut product launching Revolut in the USA.
You know, I'll probably not go deep into specifics because much of those insights it's too early for me to cover. But I can just give you some kind of top of mind things that by having lived in the United States, I haven't lived for a long time in Europe, but by having lived in the United States, I know what pain points people in the United States have. And again, those pain points are kind of obvious if you look into the companies which are growing the fastest in the United States in recent years. So probably you can just Google it and find it. So I'm not opening many secrets. And then Europe, you can project to yourself whether you think those problems apply to Europe or not, and how much do they apply. So talking about specific pain points, again, like financial products should be solving for customer pain points, right? Generally, managing your money and keeping your money is already a huge enough problem, but you still need to be like, there is so many financial institutions out there that you have to think very specifically on how you're going to be better than all of them, because in a pool of 1,000 companies, it's just really hard to stand out. So the problems I clearly see, and I see again, companies which are growing the fastest in the United States solving are like, number one, like lots of companies just do not have bank accounts, right? It's kind of, it seems weird, but in fact, many families just do not have bank accounts. And for example, when they get paychecks, they get a paper check, and then they bring those paper checks into like so-called cashing companies, which take quite a bit of money from them to give them cash or to give them again some kind of payment card, etc. So the question why this happens, like there is multiple reasons. So number one, sometimes criteria to open bank account are not that straightforward. So customers need to pass know your customer procedures, and many of those procedures are just not straightforward. But there are some financial reasons for this as well. The fees are very high, specifically in the United States. I don't think that's the case in Russia, and I'm not sure that's the case in Europe. For example, when your bank account gets overdrawn, and that means you're trying to get more money out of your bank than you actually have, it's very typical in the US to get fees like $35 to $50 for just trying to overdraw your bank account without even getting your transaction accomplished. So, and that's shocking to many people. For example, you expect when you ask for more money than you have, you would expect bank to actually allow this transaction, maybe charge you some fee on top of it, but at least transaction goes through. What's happening in the US is when you have this type of transaction, it would fail, and at the same time the fee of again 35 to 50, which is quite a substantial fee, would be charged, and that results in many cases the organization that tries to charge your bank, like your rent provider or again some other company that you have maybe recurring payments set up, they would try again and they would try again, and you get hit with those fees multiple times. So that, from my standpoint, is one of the most ridiculous problems in the US today. And the way it reveals itself is banks make on those fees more than all customers in the US spend on groceries, or either groceries or vegetables. So it's, I think it's $30-ish billion revenue item for banks in the US just from those types of fees, like not from transfers, not from subscriptions for their products. So I'll probably pause there to not go too far, but that's just one specific problem, which if you solve it well, and that's just like huge fees, there is no single reason in the world those fees should be that big. They only stem from the fact that banks can do it. No one has ever bothered to compete with them on this dimension. And the companies that grow fastest just reduce those fees or remove them.
Recording in progress.
Super successful.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I thought this would be helpful for all of those who are building their products and expanding to the US market, because I know there are a lot of companies that want to conquer the US market. So this was very helpful. Thank you so much. And what would you say are some of the traps that can novice product managers fall into while following the approach of focusing on solving customers' problems?
Yes, that's another great question. I'm hoping that we'll have plenty of young, aspiring product managers here. So again, I probably started with this. I can repeat it once again, but the main mistake you can make as a product manager and generally in life is to just assuming that now you know everything. And there is lots of flavors of this mistake as you grow. So as you grow more mature, obviously, as you get more experience, you learn that, well, there are things that you don't know and you don't know about those things you don't know, etc. But early on, your confidence is just peaking. There is even confidence curve. Like the less you know, the more confident you are. So basically, as you get more experience and more mature, it's kind of a negative as well. Confidence is helpful, but being overconfident is something that's definitely not going to yield good results in terms of you building great products. Again, there is healthy amount of confidence. I'm not saying that you should be like inconfident, etc. But early on, people are known to be too confident. So going into depth, asking more questions than actually making statements early on will pay good service to you. And then the other things, again, the running experiments, I'm assuming, is just becoming so common these days. But then, like, some people just think that, oh, I ran this A/B test, like A is better than B, so now I can confidently go. So in that case, you still lack depth in many cases. Like, you need to figure out what exactly the variables are. Like, are you actually comparing apples to apples? Or in many cases, I see A/B tests where apples and oranges are being compared, or even worse, like apples are being compared to like cars, like not even the same type of fruit or vegetable. You would be comparing apples to tomatoes or potatoes, etc. Like that's just two kinds of mistakes, but there is an infinite number of them, obviously.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very insightful. I'm sure the newbies in the product management will take this into account. And I have another great question for you. What would you do and what to do in case when customer problems encounter business needs, like revenue growth or cost cutting? You mentioned before, like, okay, you should strive to grow your company, but it's not necessarily what customer needs or wants, right? So could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so I think to restate your question, you're asking that as a product manager, you're serving not just customers, but you're like, from my standpoint, you're serving three important stakeholders. You're serving your customers, you're serving your shareholders, basically the company itself, and then you're serving the company employees. So those are the three usual stakeholders that you serve. And then there is a variety of opinions, who of them is the most important, etc. There is full consensus that all of them are important, but then different companies stress different priorities on those. Some, like Amazon one and like plenty of other companies, say that customer is the most important thing, right? You always please your customer, everything else follows. The company is going to be successful. With successful company, employees are going to be happy. There is plenty of companies that these days that start saying, whether they actually deliver or not is a separate question, but they start at least saying loudly that employees is the most important factor. In fact, only happy employees can deliver good service to the customers, and then good customers will take care of the company. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then again, the third aspect, obviously, shareholders and the company itself. It's kind of not very fashionable these days to say that we're serving company first. But if you look into what many organizations are doing, in fact, they favor shareholders the most, and they kind of just talk about customers and employees. So the importance of those three stakeholders is clear. The relative priorities are different in different companies. And then you're asking a question, so what happens when serving one of those stakeholders come at the cost of serving the other? For example, when you charge the customer high fees, arguably the company loses money and then the customer is gaining, on the opposite, the company is gaining money and the customer is losing money, etc. So the answer to this type of question is yes, when different stakeholders come into conflict with each other, when serving one is going against the other, like those are not ideal situations. You have to make a call, right? In some cases, life is life. You just need to pick if you cannot deliver, for example, improvement to customers and at the same time to the company. But the mindset should be, is those priorities should not always, they don't have to always come into conflict with each other. It often happens.
Let's move on to one of the next questions we have prepared for you is, what are some of the ways, what would you recommend to build communication with the management team about the strategy of focusing on customer needs? And do you have any examples from your practice that you can share with us?
Okay, so on alignment topic, and again, to wrap up the previous discussion, is as a product manager, you need to understand those three important stakeholders. You need to focus on initiatives when you can simultaneously improve situations across multiple angles, like when you make the situation better for both customers and employees in the company. When it's not possible, then it's a call, right? Like, unfortunately, those situations, you cannot prevent them. You cannot always make everyone happy. Okay, sorry, next question. I'm slowly getting interrupted all the time.
Yes, sure. Okay, so the next question for you would be, what would you say was the difference between solving the customer problems in an early stage startup and a large corporation, like the early age and large corporation? You have experience working in on all of these fields. How do you take into account the current company strategy?
Okay, yeah, it's another great question. I would say the main difference between young companies at the very beginning of their life cycle, and older companies, usually that comes to the availability of resources, right? Young companies usually basically are struggling for financing. They're struggling for many different things, such as they struggle to hire employees, they struggle to build the product, etc. But normally the case for 95%, maybe 99% plus startups to stop operating is that they run out of cash, right? The reason that companies stop operating is not that they cannot hire employees and everyone quits, or for example, that the product is not great and there is still lots of cash in the bank. The most typical reason is that you're running out of cash. So for young companies, it's important to understand that for you to be a sustainable, successful company and to serve plenty of customers and to, again, deliver maximum impact, you really need to focus on making your company, like helping it survive and making it to the next round of funding or the next business milestone, etc. So that's the primary priority for young companies, for small companies, for startups, to not let it die, to not let it run out of cash. For larger companies, when this type of threat is already not, like, for example, not threatening in the next year or next month, etc. The key challenges become, so you need to be focusing on longer term at the same time delivering on your immediate customers' needs, right? So the key challenge is that you have a certain set of customers today and they have their problems. You need to be solving those problems. But then as you grow, you might realize that you're going after a completely different set of customers, right? The example could be with Netflix, right? The first service companies, customers that ordered CDs by mail, and it was such a small number of customers. And then eventually they started streaming and they started producing their own content, etc. So the trick for larger companies becomes, again, what is my impact? What do I want to be? Are those customers that I have today the right customers for me to have tomorrow? And should I just be increasing their number, or should I be materially changing my target customer base and going after different type of customers? So that's the key challenge for the larger companies. Again, for smaller companies, it's largely staying in the market, being able to sustain yourself for long enough often means becoming successful, like Forrest Gump analogy in this case. You just keep doing something, you do it for a long time, and then suddenly the wind blows into your sail and you become successful, right? So that's the Forrest Gump approach, just persist for small startups.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question from our audience from watching YouTube. Okay, so the question is, could you give, or are there any tips on validating B2B ideas?
Any tips on validating B2B ideas? Again, I think general framework still applies. You do need to talk to your customers and figure out if they have those problems or not. Sometimes, again, people give advice that you first realize that you have that problem and you go solve that problem for yourself. I don't know how I feel about it. It usually does not hurt if you have the same problem and a million other people have your problem. But sometimes you can fall into a trap. Again, that could be a trap for young product managers, not just for young product managers. Like if you have a problem and if it's super painful for you, you tend to generalize it to everyone else, right? You tend to think that, oh my God, everyone else must have the same problem. So how about I go solve it? But the trick is it's not too difficult for you to actually talk to, let's just say 10 to 100 people. Ideally, my magic number is about 1,000. So whenever I want to learn about customers, you do need to get closer to 1,000 data points to start getting more confident that you actually understand things. And the reason for this is, again, like 10 or 100 may still not give you a large enough sample size for specific types of problems. 1,000 usually will have you will give you at least tens of data points on even rare types of cases. So you'll be a lot more confident. So yeah, nothing specific to B2B here, but just do not, for example, do not overemphasize your problem, and do not assume that if you have a given problem and if it's super painful for you, that everyone else has it. Other than this, go talk to people who are running small businesses and ask them what their problems are. On top of that, in some cases, you could look into statistics, right? Sometimes statistics is available for those small companies, and you can just look into their P&Ls, and you can just try to see what their problems are from the numbers. Not the most reliable way, but if you get a sample of, let's just say, 1 million small companies, and if they all have particular problems, they all struggle with configuring ads, or again, hiring people, or running some processes, that should be able that should help you validate your ideas.
Thank you so much. Now we have 7 minutes before our presentation ends, and I would like to ask any of the audience if you guys would like to ask any question. If you do, please raise your hand, and we will unmute you. This is a very unique opportunity to ask Vasily your question and get some tips. So before you gather your thoughts, I will go ahead and ask another question. What would you say? Let's say, like, you're always speaking from your own experience, and what you just said about data and experiments. What I really liked is that I read one of your articles that you did an interview, and you said that data shows past, and you should not get fixated on data. Yeah. Could you elaborate on that idea? I was really thrilled to read that. Could you tell us a bit more about this idea?
Yeah, thanks for reminding it. That one, I also personally think is a big enough revelation. I was always super passionate about data. I come from technical education, and everyone says that you have to be data-driven. That's actually also how young product managers are being tasked today, and they've been said that your focus on data is great. I do believe focusing on data is not a bad thing overall, because if you don't know your data, chances are you're just basically like flying blind or driving blind. So you definitely don't want to be flying blind. But once you know your data, so you have to know your data, and you have to make sure that the decisions you make kind of make sense from the data standpoint. But then if you just think of what the data is something that you measured, and you usually measure things in the past, right? You cannot really measure things in the future. And then you go into different levels of depth of what it means. Sometimes, like, you can go even further, like saying that in physics, for example, if you measure something, then you actually cannot measure things without making change, right? Like, by measuring, you're actually already introducing change to the behavior. And in business, and with customers, it also makes sense in many, many cases. So if you just make an attempt to measure something, you might already like hide the actual value of the variable that you're trying to measure. So the way you think about this data, once you have it and once you understand how it impacts your decisions, it becomes the matter of skill. It's more art than science for you to understand, like, can I actually project this into the future? So that's the key question you want to ask. And there are key situations when the answer is no, you obviously cannot. And those situations could be when you're going after a completely different customer segment, right? If you know that my customer base that I'm serving today is not the right one, I'm going to be switching tomorrow to a different customer base. In that case, you cannot rely on your data. If your company is growing fast, that's also the case when data is not always too reliable, simply because when you double every half a year, and there is plenty of companies which grow much even faster than this, right? If you double every year or every half a year, chances are your customer base is going to be completely different tomorrow. So you have to be thinking in advance, like what problems would those customers have, and how you solve those problems with customers. So yeah, probably that's it. So data is still important. Do not discard it. Do not just say that it measures the past, hence it's irrelevant. But do ask yourself a question like, what I measured, how much does it apply to my future? How much does it describe my customers? Sometimes it also is not about you, right? You might be willing to service the same customers, like Kodak is an example, right? And your sales might be going up, right? People are buying more film and they're printing more photos, etc., and everything just looks good until the day when it suddenly just doesn't happen anymore. So in those cases, also just looking at the data, because I'm pretty sure management was quite happy to see the statistics until it suddenly just started going down was as a rock, and it was too late to change things.
This was great. We have 2 more minutes. I think I'll ask you one last question, very short one. What advice would you give yourself, like, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, like whatever, like at the very beginning of your career, what would be the tip and recommendation, advice you would give yourself to maybe move faster?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the main advice is being optimistic pays off. In many cases, we just focus on what could possibly go wrong, and we just try to risk manage those scenarios. Like, what if this goes wrong? What if this goes wrong? And it impacts our investments, and it impacts many things in our behavior. In fact, if you look into what actually happens and who succeeds the most, is being optimistic and just thinking, what if things go right, right? What could happen to this company if things go right? So this mindset will ultimately make you a lot more successful. But again, at the same time, I like it's not just black and white. It's always there is shades of gray. I still like advice of being paranoid, and actually my favorite business book is Only Paranoid Survives. So while being super optimistic and focusing on what if things go well, it still helps, especially for smaller companies, to be like really paranoid about, did I check all of my assumptions? What could happen if this assumption doesn't go well? So do your due diligence, but be as optimistic as you can. That pays off.
Great, thank you so much. We have more questions, so I will ask you to join Spatial Chat and follow there. And ask all the questions you have. Vasily, thank you so much. This was really great. I hope this was very inspiring to all the product managers, aspiring and experienced. I'm sure everyone found something useful in your presentation today. Thank you so much for finding the time, for joining us, and for giving us your very valuable insights. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, guys.